We laugh at conspiracy theories, yet some take them seriously. Today we will conduct an experiment and I will show that Albert Camus' The Plague is a description of a staged epidemic, and the entire process was of course inspired by foreign pharmaceutical companies. I invite you to this inspiring adventure. Stay with me. Let's start with the setting. Oran is a modern city where people live to get rich, so they don't have time for any metaphysical pondering. The inhabitants are unable to accept the fact that they could die during a plague, like medieval peasants. Camus convincingly outlines the social mechanisms accompanying the lockdown, that moment of suspension when the streets and media begin to suspect that something is happening, but it's not yet clear what. The media starts to investigate and people see and simultaneously don't see the changes. Practical people, preoccupied with their own affairs, rationalize events to avoid facing the facts. The world is turned upside down and the concierge still suspects someone of throwing rats. When the number of rats increases, he becomes depressed and doesn't understand where they come from. He lacked the imagination to connect the rats with 5G, which was a pretext for chipping people through vaccines, allowing powerful corporations to finally control the vagrant in the park for millions of dollars. Only now does it seem so obvious. In a different way, Dr. Rio's mother accepts dead rats with indifference and claims that the rats in the city are weak, because they ate only potatoes and left the meat. These two characters provide crucial clues to an alternative understanding of reality, a conspiracy, or racial degeneration. The initial death statistics didn't impress the inhabitants, as who, apart from necrophiliacs, would have followed them before. It was the gradual increase in the number of deaths that made people think. What's happening in the economy? Prices went crazy, but people didn't spend any less. Characters like Cotard profited from this, a scoundrel whom Grand interrupted from successfully hanging himself. Cotard felt increasingly comfortable in the paralyzed city, where formal paths lost their significance, and one could gain quite a bit from shady deals, smuggling, or simple speculation. In The Plague, we meet a whole array of characters who embody different attitudes toward the plague. Some fared better, others worse. But from today's perspective, there is still a lack of an anti-vaccine flat-earther conspiracy theorist, whose role was played by the concierge. There are occasional flashes of human naivety, which are marginal. For example, a new newspaper, the Epidemic Courier, was established with the mission of informing citizens about the progress or regression of the disease, to be objective and based on expert opinions. But in reality, the newspaper was limited to publishing advertisements for new plague-preventing preparations. Tarot also mentions menthol lozenges disappearing from pharmacies because many people believed that sucking them protected them from infection. Others turned to shamanism, obtaining protective medallions or St. Roch amulets. Finally, historical prophecies began to be printed, which were replaced by journalistic visions of the future after they were exhausted. Tarot and Grand are paper characters somewhat taken out of context, yet they complement each other perfectly. Tarot is a hero on a mission, a man who uses simple language in good faith. He leaves home to save lives and redeem his father's guilt, a prosecutor who sentenced people to death. It sounds somewhat kitschy, and this kitsch is reflected in Grand, who realizes that every spoken sentence, not only those by Tarot, are cheap, poor, and unable to go beyond the first sentence of his novel. He feels shallow, hence the titanic effort, analogous to the effort of the hero of Nausea, who tried to acquire all the world's knowledge by memorizing successive volumes of the encyclopedia. Grand is further along. He wants to express all the world's knowledge by condensing it into a sentence, shown to Dr. Rio after a drink, which is actually showy but shallow. On a beautiful May morning, an elegant Amazon, sitting on a magnificent chestnut, rode through the blossoming alleys of the Bois de Boulogne. Why did Grand need to create a Terminator sentence? A text that would force the publishing house to take off their hats. Is he such a vain man, craving fame, this ordinary clerk? Now, as an experiment, I will show how easily facts can be manipulated and a conspiracy theory created. Because actually we don't have valuable, unquestionable accounts of the course of the plague in Oran. It was all a conspiracy controlled from Paris to be able to test the vaccine, with impunity. Rio. Dr. Rio is one of the narrators. Actually, he is transparent, boring, and consists only of duties. He works conscientiously and unremarkably, saying about himself, "I have no passion for heroism and sanctity. He cares only to be a human being." His wife supposedly left him by going to a sanatorium, but when she left, they mentioned something about starting everything anew. We can assume that there was some crisis. Rieu is supposedly conscientious, but he did not report Rambert, whom he knew wanted to escape from the city. He also had information about Cotard's shady dealings. In addition, he himself abused his position and official gasoline allocation when he aimlessly drove around the city, bathing in the sea at night with another man, which further casts his marriage in a suspicious light. He illegally exchanged correspondence with his wife in the sanatorium, jeopardizing the sacrifice of thousands of people. The plague could simply escape beyond the city walls. Can we trust such a person? Someone who does not follow procedures in quarantine, who, contrary to regulations, hides the sick tarot? Let us not be deceived by Rieu's generally good reputation. I will soon show with whom he was in collusion. The second narrator is Tarot, a man without a family, homeless, once the wayward son of a respected prosecutor. Wherever he appeared, strange things happened. Crises, an actual devil incarnate, possibly associated with Castel, but the evidence was destroyed after his death by Rieu. Castel, a pharmacist, a doctor, a trusted man from Paris, through whom an invented panic was used to test at least 2 versions of a vaccine on living people. He knew full well that there was no plague, so he agreed for his wife to join him in Oran, even though theoretically she was risking danger. She was the only one allowed in, and that is probably sufficient evidence that there was no disease, because who in their right mind would risk their life and enter a plague-ridden city? Castel often communicated with Rieu, who, as we know, was a shady character. The conspiracy is spreading wider and wider within the Oran establishment. At the end of the first month, the church decided to organize a week of prayers so that people could have a greater chance of getting infected en masse, but also feel that someone would explain to them why they caught this illness, even though they had been in lockdown for a month. Panelu, a Jesuit, as befits a decent priest, intercedes for people with God and out of love for his neighbor, states simply, "The plague fell on you villains because you were pissing in the sea on Sunday, instead of sitting in church." He is a theologian. He wrote a work on Augustine, who claimed that evil is the absence of good. And he was good, so he thought he had a kind of immortality code. Father Panelu, confronted with the eternal problem of theology, falls to pieces, as how is it possible for an innocent child to suffer? He changes, delivers another iconoclastic sermon, because unfortunately he did not know the achievements of Vistula theology, that the child provokes and leads priests to evil, but that was Panelu, not Pedelu. By the way, it is worth noting the erotic relationship of the priest with an older devotee, who interrupted the conversation with the prophecies of Saint Ottilia, and Panelu dismissed her impatiently. Later he was unable to regain the respect of the hostess despite sincere intentions. We almost feel how Panelu tries to kindle at least a spark of sympathy, praising the cheesecake, the color of the curtains, which were probably disgusting anyway. And he still tries, but because he didn't listen to her on the first day, nothing worked. Later, Panelu dies, somewhat suicidally, because he forbids the hostess to call a doctor until it was too late. Panelu was not a true priest because he allowed doubt. His second sermon was iconoclastic, and he should have expressed active regret for it in the Curia, but he deliberately volunteered to help the sick to get infected and die. The book is strange, parabolic. Indeed, it grows out of the spirit of wartime experiences, but focuses on the individual in the face of the absurdity of death, the plague. We see people who, like Antigone, fight to bid farewell to the deceased with dignity, even when the process of sending bodies to eternal rest was optimized, and bodies were transported by separate trams whose final stop was a closed-off area, yet flowers were still found on the crowded bodies. This is the spirit of humanity, the stubbornness to maintain at least a semblance of form, a semblance of normalcy. The epidemic has one aspect that eludes us, which robs it of psychological impact: its pace. Understanding its power requires the ability of abstract thinking. It is different from a great fire, a flood, or an earthquake. We find bodies, count and estimate losses, and there is something tangible. The epidemic is like a steamroller that crushes everything in its path, and we don't want to understand the situation until the steamroller runs over someone close to us or us. Camus, a moralist, points out patterns of behavior. He does not present flawless heroes charging the barricades, but decent people who, despite their weaknesses, stand up to the imperfections of this world, and despite the awareness of inevitable defeat, like Prometheus, try to contribute in a small way to the fight against evil, lies, and the pandemic. Camus believed in the person who does their part. He imagined that Sisyphus could be happy. That is the whole art of humanity. The Plague is a theological book, but written from an atheistic perspective. Camus points out the example of a person who steps out of their comfort zone, like Jesus, who did not hesitate and accepted the challenge. Father Panelu was a coward until he confronted the plague from the sidelines, speaking from the pulpit about the plague that affected you. Only a change in attitude and accepting the challenge makes him a human being. Camus is a great stylist and storyteller. Here is an excerpt. The narrator is rather inclined to believe that by attaching too much importance to beautiful deeds, one indirectly pays homage to evil. It allows one to suppose that beautiful deeds have such a high price because they are rare, while wickedness and indifference are often the engines of human actions. The plague abolished value judgments. It was apparent, as no one was interested, for example, in the quality of the clothes or food they bought. Everything was accepted wholesale. This aspect of the pandemic is least felt here, because before it people were mostly indifferent to the quality of life, so there are differences. The plague doesn't only have a pessimistic, cosmic meaning. In an absurd world devoid of metaphysics, Taro is not alone. He found a friend in Rio. In a sense, the entire group of main characters forms a closed circle of valuable individuals breaking out of the passive observer's perspective. And what is the reward for virtue? Nothing, that is virtue. A perfunctory smile among friends and satisfaction in fulfilling one's duty. Taro repeatedly mentions his search for a saint without God, which misled the perspective because he himself was such a saint. Camus says that disagreement with evil speaks to the dignity of each of us. Therefore one must fight, even if there is no hope of victory, or more precisely, especially then, one must fight. So does Camus end the story on a positive note? Plot-wise, yes, the plague leaves the city. People rejoice, celebrate. They delude themselves that it is all over. Camus ends the story by stating that the absurd teaches nothing. This is also some progress when one is aware of the lack of awareness. Camus is perceived as a defender of the individual and an advocate for the oppressed.